The UFC is rumored to be returning back to Brazil in Rio de Janeiro on May of this year, which could be a pretty good card. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about what that card could be. Could it be a fight night? Could it be a main event? And then I'm going to talk about who could headline the event, if it's a pay-per-view, if it's a really big pay-per-view, or if it is just a fight night, because there is quite a bit that could go into this card to make it a pretty decent card for Brazil, as you guys may or may not know. Recently, a lot of Brazilians were signed to the UFC, especially on Dana White's Contender Series, so I think we probably will see quite a few debuting fighters on the card. But more importantly, I think we're going to see some of the big names that the UFC does have from Brazil as well. Let me know if you think I forgot anyone. This isn't a card builder. This is more just talking about the news and speculating what the event could be. And the reason why I think it could be a pay-per-view is it does roughly line up with the UFC's plans. And by roughly, I mean I don't think UFC 301 has been officially announced yet. And it does kind of work in with the timings that we have, because UFC 300 is the furthest away officially announced event in April the 13th. And then from there, there's nothing. So maybe UFC 301 could take place in Brazil. I think it would make sense because Brazil probably does take up a major part of the UFC's audience, and they have put on events there in the past. Some of their biggest fighters are from Brazil, which I will talk about in this video. I'm talking about fighters like Jose Aldo, and then fighters that are in this video as well. So let's get into it. If the UFC was to do a massive pay-per-view, they would have to call on somebody with a big name. And the way that this works depends on who his potential opponent fights and when that happens. Because I'm talking about Charles Oliveira, but I want to kind of just give you guys my thinking of why this could work. Ramadan for 2024 is, I believe, March the 10th. And the Saudi Arabia card is March the 4th. So Islam Makhachev, if he fights on the March the 4th card in Saudi Arabia, obviously he won't fight Charles Oliveira in May. Or maybe if he fights on the UFC 299 card earlier in March, then that's one day before Ramadan begins. Obviously he won't be fighting Charles Oliveira in May. So what I'm kind of trying to say here is there is opportunity for the UFC to go out there and do the Oliveira versus Makhachev matchup in Brazil, because Oliveira fought against Makhachev in Dubai, which is kind of Islam Makhachev's sort of home area of the world. This would be the home area of the world for Charles Oliveira. Now, you could say maybe because Charles Oliveira had to pull out of the last fight, you don't want to see him defend his belt in Brazil. Or you could say, well, maybe Justin Gaethje should get the title shot, because there is a good chance that is going to happen as well. Because Justin Gaethje versus Islam Makhachev seems to be the general vibe that a lot of people are accepting and a lot of people are anticipating the matchup to be. And I feel like if they're going to do that, they probably have to do it before Ramadan, because I highly doubt Makhachev's going to defend his title during Ramadan. So that would have to be in the Saudi Arabia card, of course, or the UFC 299 card as well. Either of those two, or if Makhachev was to fight after Ramadan, he could fight against Charles Oliveira, and this would be about a month after Ramadan completes, I believe. So he would probably have enough time to prepare for a title fight. That's the big option. The other option you could go with is Alex Pereira, which is also a massive option, but I haven't done that because I'm relatively confident he's going to be somewhat involved in that UFC 300 card. But if you think that you're going to see Alex Pereira on this card, leave me know in the comments below and who you would match him up with. Maybe it could be Jamal Hill, because that would give Jamal Hill an extra month or so from the UFC 300 card to recover from his injury and then fight on this card against Alex Pereira. But Charles Oliveira is probably the #1 option for the biggest name they possibly could do for this card. The next one, of course, is Alejandra Panoa himself, who has requested to be on the card. He's from Rio de Janeiro. He wants to be on the card. And you could do a couple of things with Panoa. He is definitely not a big enough name to headline a pay-per-view by himself. He's the lowest followed champion in the UFC right now. The UFC probably wants Moreno to be the champion, let's be honest. So that's what they could do. They could do Alejandra Panoa versus Brandon Moreno in a 4th fight, which I do think Panoa would win again. He's just beaten... He's got Moreno's number. I think he's kind of like the perfect fighter to beat Moreno. Or they could do Panoa versus Manel Kape, which would be a fresher matchup, although it would be another rematch. Panoa, I mean, there's not many fighters in the UFC that have 32 pro fights, and there's not many flyweights on the entire planet that have 32 fights. Panoa's fought everybody, win or lose. you can't really get a lot of matchups for Pantella that he hasn't already had. So you could do a fight night with Pantella headlining. Now, the issue would be the money, because Pantella, at this point, being a defending champion, has absolutely earned the right to those pay-per-view points. He won't get pay-per-view points headlining a fight night unless the UFC could give him an extra monetary incentive, or maybe just headlining a card in Rio de Janeiro as a fight night could be good enough for him. I don't know. Maybe Pantella versus Moreno 4 would sell enough pay-per-views to be a solo headliner. Let me know, do you think Pantella's a big enough name, or do you think Moreno's a big enough name to carry a pay-per-view himself against a lesser-known fighter in Alejandra Panoa, even though he's the champion? That's what you could do. Either the co-main event to a Charles Oliveira or Pereira fight, or a main event of a fight night, but Pantella probably won't get the pay-per-view points that he has earned at this point in his career. And now we move on to some other fighters from Brazil that could headline a fight night, that could go out there and be the biggest name on the card, and be the one that does bring in the attention and build their card around them. I feel like I've absolutely forgotten someone, because now we're going to be jumping to Edson Barboza. And now I know Gilbert Burns could be the one, but Gilbert Burns has a fight booked against JDM, so it's not going to be him. I've gone with Edson Barboza. Now, Edson Barboza could headline a fight night. He did it last. He fought against Sadiq Youssef on a UFC Picks card. Now, I understand the name value that you need to have to headline an Apex card is not quite in comparison to headlining a card where you have to sell at an arena. But I feel like a lot of Brazilian fans, now I'm not a Brazilian fan, so you let me know if you are from Brazil, is Edson Barboza a big enough name for the UFC to build an entire card around? Another person could be Jailton Almeida, but he's got a fight booked as well. You can't do that. So Edson Barboza is who I've come up with. And the biggest possible fight for Edson Barboza right now, rankings-wise, it doesn't make sense. But I do think it's a possible, I think it's a realistic matchup. Could be Edson Barboza versus Josh Emmett. Now, Josh Emmett is not a young guy. I think he's almost 40 years old himself. Edson Barboza is, of course, almost 40 years old as well. He's 37. He's still got a bit to go. And he's in really good shape for a 37-year-old. Barboza, I don't think has fought Emmett. They've meant to have fought each other before. I think this is a fight that you could do as the headliner. Otherwise, you could do Edson Barboza versus maybe like Alex Caceres if Caceres doesn't have a fight booked. But that just, it's not as good as Emmett versus Barboza. I think Barboza versus Emmett, if you're going to do it now. Headline a fight in Brazil. I think Emmett might be able to take it out, but it would be a good matchup. That's kind of what I was thinking. Another one is Vicente Luque. Luque's ready to go. He's ready to rumble. I mean, maybe you could do Vicente Luque versus Ian Gary. I don't know when Ian Gary's fight against Jeff Neal is, but maybe Gary could headline a card here because, you know, he has trained at Shooter Box before. He can come over to Brazil to do the fight. But Vicente Luque is another option. I didn't actually really look at matchups for him, but he is, I believe, coming off that win. He is coming off the win over to RDA. He was meant to fight Gary. Gary pulled out with that sickness. And then Luque actually declined replacement opponents. The UFC was offering him replacement opponents, and Luque apparently declined them, according to Dana White. So maybe Luque had his own injury. Maybe. But what I'm trying to say is that Vicente Luque is ready to go. He's a guy that you could put on this card. Pay-per-view main card, of course, like Barboza potentially. Or headline the card with Luque versus another pretty big matchup. The biggest one you could probably do is Luque versus Jeff Neal or Ian Gary. I feel like that's probably the fight that you would do as a headliner of a fight night. Let me know what you think of that one. It depends when Gary's fight is, because I forgot when it's booked for. I think it's booked for January on 297. So I think Gary would have... No, 298, I think. Anyway, I think Gary might be able to make the fight. That's kind of my point. Let's move on. Diego Lopez, a pretty big name, represents Brazil, represents Mexico. If he's not on the Mexico card, put him on here. I mean, his training partner, Irene Aldana, is going to be on the card, which is kind of why I was thinking that you could do him and Alexa Grasso, but at the same time, it's a little bit awkward because Diego Lopez does corner Alexa Grasso. So maybe for a title fight, she wants Diego Lopez in her corner, giving her the advice, and doesn't want him on that same card, which makes sense. So maybe for the Irene Aldana situation, maybe Irene Aldana doesn't need Lopez in her corner, maybe something like that. So Lopez can also fight on the card alongside her, even though they do train at the same gym. Then we move on to Jessica Andrade. big name right now. I mean, she just knocked out Mackenzie Dern, made me look like a complete idiot by picking Dern, made us all probably look a little bit silly. I think a lot of people did pick Dern, but a lot of people did pick Andrade. She turned it around. She got the big KO over Dern. Dern's also a fighter you could put on this card that I forgot about. But anyway, Jessica Andrade definitely should and could be on this card for sure. Next one is Caio Borralho. Doesn't have a fight booked. Currently ranked number 15 in the UFC. I'm sure he would be very keen on being on this card for sure. And then you can't bring up Brazilian fighters without bringing up Charles Oliveira's minions. These clones of Charles Oliveira that fight the exact same way as him and have absolutely... They're literally the same. These are literally Charles Oliveira's minions. Alves Brenner, Felipe dos Santos, and Daniel Santos. Charles Oliveira's minions. If you put in Charlie Olives on the card, put his minions on the card as well. I'm sure they'll probably all win because there's something about these guys, man. I don't know what it is. They are literally just clones of Charles Oliveira. They fight exactly the same, especially Felipe dos Santos. I don't know what it is about him, but it's just crazy. So yeah, Charlie Olive's minions, I'm sure there's probably more of them out there. Shootbox is a pretty big gym. It's a well-known gym. There'll be more of them. I've got another one to end off the video. It's a weird one. No one really laughed at me for putting him on UFC 300 against Nick Diaz, but this man has been asking for a retirement fight. This man is not retired. Damen Meer. He says that he wants to retire on one more fight. The man is 46 years old. UFC, just give him something. Damen Meer versus Gunnar Nelson. Grappler versus grappler. I'm pretty sure they probably fought each other now that I bring it up. Maybe, yeah, they have. Okay, Damen Meer versus Gunnar Nelson rematch. Whatever, let's just do it. Just do something. Just give Damen Meer a fight. Let this man retire. I'm sure he'll probably take anything at this point. Damen Meer versus Joe Lozon if they haven't fought before. I mean, I'm pretty sure Damen Meer will be prepared to do anything. That's a little bit of a funny one. But anyway, that's kind of it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think that my card ideas are good ideas? Do you think that the UFC coming to Brazil is going to be fun? I think it's going to be great. Personally, I'm looking forward to it. And with all that being said, let me know what you think in the comments below.